So, as I said, my name is Andrew. I'm a longtime friend of the Chefetz family and of Dr. Chefetz in particular, and it's a great pleasure to welcome him. As many of you know, I'm sure you're some of you are in the psychiatric community. The memory and the mind are complex. They're flexible and resilient enough to withstand painful traumatic experiences, to conceal information from ourselves and from those we interact with in order to provide ourselves the safe space to deal with those issues. It's a defensive mechanism that aids in the traumatic moment, but it has the potential to become a hindrance over time. The self becomes in fear of itself. Dr. Chefetz is a psychiatrist in private practice in Washington, D.C. He was the president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. He is the founder and chair of their Dissociative Disorders Psychotherapy Training Program. And he is taught around the world in the field of dissociative trauma. He's also a faculty member at the Washington School of Psychiatry, the Institute of Contemporary Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis, and the Washington Center for Psychoanalysis. He's on the editorial boards of the Journal of Trauma and Dissociation and Dynamic Psychiatry. He's written numerous journal articles on psychoanalytic perspectives on trauma and dissociation. And now he's come out with his book, published by Norton in their Interpersonal Neurobiology series, Intensive Psychotherapy for Persistent Dissociative Processes that Fear of Feeling Real. The practice of talking therapy in the field of dissociative disorders has been underappreciated until recently. Work with patients in recovery is emotionally challenging, both for them and for their clinical psychiatrist. Dr. Chefetz is honest about the challenges. And with a cogent and clear style, he's a gifted storyteller. He takes the reader into the consultation room with precise, accessible language that delves into the clinical issues. His book is interesting, informative, and thorough, and it's useful even to a layperson who's curious about the subject of dissociation. He's personally curious, and that curiosity in his own treatment method and his work with his patients comes through in the book. It's my great pleasure to welcome him today. I believe Dr. Richard Chefetz.
It is indeed a real pleasure to look out and see friends, family, colleagues. It's really a gift. Thank you for coming. My hope today is to whet your appetites about what's in the book and about dissociation and the dissociative disorders, because they are disorders, problems that are underappreciated in terms of the depth and breadth that it affects clinical discourse. So I'm going to present to you some information about dissociation and making meaning, talk a little bit about dissociative processes rather than emphasizing what's usually emphasized, dissociative identities, to talk about dissociation and the notion of self-protection, and to say a little bit about self-states and the paradigm shift that the whole field is undergoing, and then to make a comment about, okay, well, what about the rest of us? Does this have anything to do with you and me? But before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the people who have really made this book possible. My patients. I have incredible patients. I mean, they're really amazing people. And that they can put up with me for years and years of very, very difficult, hard work is a testimony to how tough and resilient people can be even when they've suffered terribly. So thank you for your willingness to share your work with everybody else. I'd like to thank my family for putting up with my absence while being present, sort of. And Catherine knows especially what it's like to travel on vacation with me over the last 3 or 4 years, and tell people afterwards, oh yeah, it was a great vacation. You know, I wrote 6 to 8 hours a day, and then Catherine and I would go out in the evening and we'd be on vacation together. And it's really true. So of all the people who were relieved that the book was finished, I think Catherine probably was most relieved after me. And to my colleagues, thank you for putting up with me. There are people in peer supervision groups and institutes and people who I've had lunch with over the years who push and tweak and challenge, and it's all been part of honing ideas and me growing. Okay, so let's begin. I have a definition of psychotherapy I'd like to pose to you, because psychotherapy is a collaborative process, you know, where two people grow and learn separately together. And psychotherapy is the condition where one person talks about what they don't want to say, while another person listens to what they don't want to hear. And still people agree to engage and be curious and do the best they can. And curiosity is the opposite of dissociation. So the book talks about feeling real on the cover even. The deal is that it's not that a person loses touch with reality when they have a mind ripe with dissociative process. It's just that kind of closing your eyes, putting on thick wool mittens, and holding reality in your hands makes it a little bit more difficult to know what feeling real might be like. So what's intensive about intensive psychotherapy? It's the relationship. That's what's intensive. My patients get inside me and I get inside them, and we meet, we engage. And that can be pretty intense. Why persistent dissociative processes? Well, the damn thing doesn't turn off. Dissociation's okay if it would only let go, but when people are hurt really badly, it doesn't turn off, it continues. And I think it's important to appreciate the persistence of the processes which are otherwise normal, and I'll explain how in just a minute. Why the fear of feeling real? Wouldn't that be, the thing to do? Feel real, rock and roll, get ready to dance. It's just that after years of dissociation, being detached from your feelings, disconnected, opening your eyes and taking off your gloves feels like having no skin. Initially like being covered only with raw flesh and still having to get on the metro during rush hour. It does get a little bit easier though, but it takes getting used to, and people really do fear their feelings coming online. So you're probably thinking, okay, well, what's that really like? And dissociation and dissociative process has been around for a long time, and one of my favorite psychoanalytic writers, Harry Dunne, is going to help us to understand a little bit about how it's been around and how something that in retrospect can seem, at least to me, pretty obvious, might not be seen for what it was. So Dunne wrote, one patient, a single woman in her early 40s, would rave against girl children, and in fantasy, his word, would describe how she would crush a girl child, if she had one, and then in a session would fall to punching herself. One day I said to her, you must feel terrified being hit like that. And she stopped and stared and said, I'm not being hit. I'm the one doing the hitting. A little shift in perspective. His patient was almost certainly in a trance-like state with staring. And he didn't quite understand, I think, what she was saying. Of course, I wasn't there. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's pretty interesting. And the next page in his book, he talked about another patient who had a relationship with a boy child and was on the way to a session, and the patient said, "Just before I set out, I felt apprehensive, as if I could burst into tears. A reaction, I suppose, to coming here." Guntrip asked him why he should feel depressed in coming to see him, and the patient replied, "I see a picture of a little boy shut up alone in a room, crying. If one were in a house where there was such a child, it would depend on how interesting one's work was, whether or not you were aware of him. Sometimes I'm aware of him." There's a shift in the patient's perspective. "Sometimes I'm aware of him, and at other times, when very busy, I forget him." And Guntrip said, "Your fantasy," Guntrip's word, "is really that you as a grown-up person are working in one room and wanting to forget a crying little boy shut up in another room. What about that?" The patient said, "The obvious thing is to go to the child and find out why he's crying and comfort him. Why didn't I do that at first? That strikes me as very odd." Now, in response to why didn't I do that at first, if it had been my patient, I would have gone with where the patient was in their perspective, just like talking with Calvin about Hobbes. And I would have said, "I know you didn't go to this child and comfort him, or find out why he was crying earlier. What do you imagine it would be like to do that now? Can you see him now if you look for him? Okay, good. Could you move over toward him so that he sees you gently approaching? What kind of thoughts and feelings do you see on his face? What concerns him?" The shift in perspective in going where the patient lives, rather than ascribing everything to fantasy as if it's an idea, rather than an in-the-mind lived experience in a different kind of mental space. And that's a lot of what the psychotherapy of dissociative disorder is like, is going where the patient is, not making them fit into your mental space, but understanding what their space is like, and then working with it. And that's counter to a lot of the dictums that I heard from my teachers, many of whom were very astute and fabulous clinicians otherwise, but it's this little kind of twist in perspective that was missing. So some of you know that dissociative disorders previously had been called multiple personality disorder. And but why? Why the change to dissociative identity, and what's the deal about multiple personalities? The fact is that most people who have this difficulty don't feel coherent enough in general about their own mental processes to feel like there's just even one whole sense of self. Things are too scattered, things are too compartmentalized. There's a not knitted together realm of experience that bombards a person and makes for kind of herky-jerky transitions between different realms of experience, different recollections. The fellow who's standing here in front of you and speaking into a microphone is different than the guy who was cooking breakfast this morning in shifts for 3 young women who were house guests from New York, and listening to them regale me with tales of partying on U Street last night. But I'm the same person, and I'm the same person who was playing with my granddaughter yesterday, playing Pick Up That Toy that just fell off the table 500 times in a row. It was delightful. Different ways of being me, and all of them flowing one to the other with intact memory and so on. But for the person with a dissociative disorder, those different ways of being may be difficult to move one to the other because there are gaps, barriers between the space of being more emotionally alive with a grandchild and less emotionally alive giving a talk, although I feel pretty alive right now, frankly. But let's look under the hood at dissociation for just a minute. And And most people who talk about dissociation don't talk about association. I think that's an error. Association is part of a sorting process, a process that is on a dialectic to create mental coherence. You need to link things together to make sense out of them, okay? We all have that. Dissociation, as a normal process, prunes the garbage. It prunes what's irrelevant. If you were focusing on what I'm saying, but also have the intrusion of noticing sound with the heating system or people walking around and visual kinds of distractions, if you have intact dissociative capacities, you'd be able to focus and concentrate on what I'm saying. You won't be distracted. That's normal dissociation. Emotional trauma pushes the dissociator pedal, so to speak, against the floor and leaves it there. And prunes experience in the service of self-protection. The things that hurt us that we don't know about don't hurt us so much. It does, though, deprive us of a narrative about what's going on. And then when we try to recall what happened, it's a blank. It's incomplete. Dissociative processes are multidimensional. One dimension of dissociative process has to do with three words: isolation, exclusion, and deflection. Isolation is borrowed easily from Freud in his 1909 paper on obsessional neurosis, where he talked about isolation of affect, denial, and undoing being the three mechanisms that were active in those people. Isolation of affect is dissociation. In fact, denial has a dissociative engine under the hood because you detach what's real from what you are saying is real, and you deny it. You say it's something else. It's not about that, it's about this. And undoing is the same kind of thing. There is this sense of, well, if I do it this way, then that didn't happen. And that detaches from reality as we know it. So these are all dissociative mechanisms. In fact, all the mechanisms of defense that his daughter Anna wrote about 1932 in her monograph have a dissociative engine under the hood. Sue Grand, who wrote elegantly about the reproduction of evil, said to me after I posted that on a listserv discussion, "You're trying to rewrite all of psychoanalysis as dissociation." Well, no, but let's call a spade a spade. Dissociation is there. Now, to isolate something is to disconnect it. To exclude it is like the process that keeps intrusions from entering. Flashbacks, that's an exclusion process that fails. And deflection is the kind of process where somebody says to you, yeah, I could talk about that, but I don't want to talk about that. I feel myself getting upset. I'm just going to go someplace else. I'm not going to discuss that. That's a deflective process. Okay? And so those are psychodynamic. Those are meaning-making processes that are related to dissociation. But there's a physiologic level that's really important. And the physiologic level includes things like depersonalization. And depersonalization is a sense of not quite somehow feeling real. In the classic sense, it's an out-of-body experience. But most people don't have out-of-body experiences. What they have with depersonalization is they feel somehow not connected. Or one person wrote about noticing their hands typing and having an experience that really wasn't their hands, and couldn't figure that out. It frightened them. They didn't understand it. Or depersonalization can be what you read about our veterans coming back from war and saying, like, I don't connect with other people. I don't feel like I'm the me I was. I don't have the feelings. PTSD, to a large extent, rests on dissociative process. Numbing, withdrawal, avoidance, all these things about regulating emotion. Okay, so depersonalization where you feel unreal, derealization where the world seems somehow unreal, phony, as if you're looking through a veil. Amnesias are not the typical fugue that you read about that makes the headlines. Amnesias are more the micro-amnesias, where you forget a little bit about what you said 5 minutes ago, and if you see your patient glazing over while you're talking about something and you stop the action and you say, excuse me, but could you tell me what we've been talking about? A lot of times they can't, but then a couple of minutes later they say, oh, I remember now. We were talking about, going fishing in the spring. So this is me, obviously. And I can say, well, I hear you got the gist of what we were talking about fishing, but do you remember that as if that was your experience, you were there, and you had that experience? Or was it more like you somehow read about it in the newspaper and you're reporting what you read? And a lot of people will say, yeah, it's the newspaper thing. That's weird, isn't it? And that's more what the amnesia is like. There's also identity confusion where someone glazes and you say, could you please tell me what your name is? And they're not able to do that. I call that identity confusion. Or identity alteration, when I would say, hey, Rich, so, what kind of fishing do you like to do? And the person replies, I don't like to fish. And why are you calling me Rich? My name is Jack. And what am I doing here? And when the hair stands up on the back of your neck, then you know there's been identity alteration, which is often the experience that people have as clinicians the first time they experience that. But that's unusual. People don't usually present that way in treatment. People usually present 85% of the time, just like you and me. Not with identity alteration, but just in conversation. And the people who have dissociative disorders, in my experience, are some of the brightest people, most confident people you will ever meet. Because in their highly effective compartments for living, they can unemotionally focus. They make fabulous engineers, computer scientists, lawyers who are risk managers. Imagine that. Having an abuse history and becoming a risk manager for a major firm. So dissociation and dissociative disorders isn't about being whacked out crazy. It's about compartments and compartmentalized function and not having that available all the time because you lose your skill set. How are we doing on time, Andrew? What do we got?
You lost your skill set?
You got me 9 minutes for me after your introduction?
I guess 9 minutes.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks for spotting me. Okay, so we're in the middle of a paradigm shift. Thomas Kuhn wrote about the structure of a revolution back in the 60s. And the notion is that advances in science take place not because people make discoveries, but because the theories that we have holes in them. And there are things that are incompatible with the theory, and we see how, well, that really doesn't fit, it's really not explainable. So the paradigm shift that we're undergoing and moving toward a self-state psychology has to do with difficulty explaining addiction, self-destructive behavior, sadomasochism, negativity, resilient shame, repetition compulsion, and self-state subjectivity. The theories aren't really good. You really have to wrap yourself into a pretzel to be able to theoretically parse out sadomasochism without evoking the notion of self-states, and then it flows easily. So there was a guy named Peter Wolf, not of the music variety, Peter Wolf. Peter Wolf studied children, and he discovered that infants have little islands of experience. They go from the active alert cooing to distress with seemingly no reason, no bridge. There's no transitional state. There's no bridge between states. It's like your baby is sitting there one moment cooing and smiling, and the next moment it's like someone stuck them with a hat pin. And they're howling. You don't know how that happened. Frank Putnam talked about how these little islands of experience represent discrete behavioral states. And that part of the theory about how dissociative disorders get going, how the self-states occur, is that there's no parenting going on to help knit those states together and build bridges. A British analyst named Christopher Bolus talked about a concept called the transformational object, which is the parent who shows up at just the right moment for the child, before the child knows that they have a problem and already has provisions for that child. I know my baby is going to be hungry, the bottle is right here, it's all warmed up, there's the whimper in the mouth. So the parent provides the transition for the child's experience and builds bridges between islands. If that kind of parenting is missing, the bridges are harder to build. John Bowlby, who worked on infant attachment, Mary Ainsworth down in Charlottesville, Mary Main out in the Midwest, showed how through their observations of infants, when infants have parents who don't build bridges and they themselves, those parents, have isolated states, discrete behavioral states, the child ends up in a place where they match their behavior to the parent. And infant attachment is not often understood as an emergency system to help maintain proximity with the caregiver. It's not the usual kind of thing that's going on. The attachment behaviors themselves are emergency behaviors where the child accommodates the parent's need. Sure, Mom, sure, Dad, I'll change if that's helpful to you. I know you're scared now, and yesterday you were scary, but I'll change. I know you don't want to have any feelings that you can see in me because it scares you to have feelings. I won't have feelings. I won't even turn around when you come in the room. And that's the way the paradigms work. So I'm going to tell you about Kelly. And Kelly came to see me about 2 or 3 years ago, and she primarily presented with depersonalization. And her primary attachment was to her mother. It was much stronger than her father. And Mom was emotionally dismissive. Mom was into control. Mom was an earnestly good mom, but Mom didn't listen to her daughter. And there is no hardcore abuse history that I've ever found in Kelly's history. Come on in and make yourself comfortable. And here's what it sounded like when Kelly and I started working about what she could see of self-states in her mind. I said to her, I'd like to invite you to look around in your mind and check to see if there are any images that go along with how you're feeling now and the dark mood that you've been talking about just picks you up and carries you away, that makes no sense to you at all. Close your eyes if that's helpful for you to focus. So with her eyes closed, she spoke nearly immediately, which surprised me. And she said, I see a little girl. She's frantic. She's desperate. It's like she's seeing something and she can't find it. I think she feels helpless. It's like she's going in circles. And I said, it sounds like the image holds a lot of the feelings you've been talking about with this dark mood stuff. I use technical language a lot. Are there other images? Yeah. There's another little girl, but she's very different. She's sitting on the ground with her knees drawn up and her head down. She's really in despair. She's given up. She's resigned to whatever it is. Yeah, she just feels helpless and nothing can help her. Does this resonate with something in your life? Yes. It's all about my mother. You know, she wasn't the stereotypical tiger mom talked about in Asian families, you know, standing over her child playing the piano for hours endlessly until she plays Beethoven to her standards. My mom wasn't that person. In some ways, I wish her abuse was that obvious. I think my recovery would be easier. I think more of what was happening between my mom and I was that she couldn't handle the emotional demands of being a mother. When I had emotional demands and they couldn't be met, this put me in a very dark place. And naturally, as a child, I'd rebel in some way, and then my mother handled me by shaming me. You ruined the family vacation. Or, whenever we try to do something nice, Kelly has to ruin it. And I said, so we can understand Frantic, who's trying and trying to get your mother to see her and make contact with her. Yes, that fits and feels right. Well, okay, how do we understand head down, knees up? She gave up. I sometimes feel like I'm at the bottom of this abyss, just sitting alone in the dark mood. Yes, that fits with the helpless despair, I said, and resignation we talked about earlier. And Kelly said, well, how am I ever going to resolve these feelings? It just feels like an endless dark place. It really doesn't help to see these images. Nothing changes. And I replied, before this is going to move toward resolution, I think we need to better understand what's going on. I'm sure you remember me talking with you earlier about using a right brain metaphor rather than a left brain language-bound experience. And she said, yeah, that makes sense to me then, and it makes sense to me now. I said, well, okay, let's go with that and see what we can learn. Take a look around inside at frantic and head down, knees up. Can you see them clearly? Yes. Good, I said. Now gently walk forward and step into the space near frantic, being careful of her space. Sit down near her. Okay. Nod your head when you're seated, and she nodded. I said, does she notice you're there? Is it okay with her to have you visit? Very permissive, very gentle. Yes, it's okay. She feels terrible. She's really anxious. Things are awful for her. Sounds like she has really been having trouble with the feelings left over from the early relationship with your mother that we just talked about. And she's remained frantic for someone to recognize her feelings and validate what she's feeling. Yes, she's never seemed to notice me either, not really. I didn't know what to do to help her. I've been really angry with her for not being able to let go of her pain. I probably also hold her responsible for my emotional unravelings. So what's happening here? I've engaged the patient where they are. There's an internal, alive space where they have an experience that's all their own, it's private, and we're talking about thoughts and feelings and relationships. And part of what will happen, which I'm not going to be reading about today, is I'll also be talking with Kelly about her attitude toward these different ways of being Kelly, which, interestingly enough, is very similar to how Mother treated Kelly. Kelly herself is dismissive of the emotional content of these states, and that dismissiveness has kept her at a distance from what she's needed to look at. So that's the nature and tenor of the work, and that's what the book is about, is to show you what the dissociative process looks like in the consulting room. And half the book is really clinical sessions with a lot of dialogue, and the last 3 chapters are mostly verbatim transcripts with some commentary. And I have to say, as my patient Alice, who's in the first chapter, a little bit in the 6th, and the subject wholly of the last 3, chapter 11 is some of my worst work. And Alice said, well, I don't know if you should include that, but actually, to be fair to me, because I look awful in chapter 10, you ought to leave it in. And I did. So the book tells the truth about what the work is, and it's very messy. And the deal is, in the end, it's all about the relationship. It's all about the relationship. It's not about technique. I've studied them. I've got 500-600 hours of training hypnosis. I know EMDR. That stuff is mostly worthless without a relationship. You have to be able to feel safe enough in the room with the other person to tolerate the techniques. It rips scabs off wounds. So a therapist needs to be open to emotion, to listen with real presence, to validate, to be curious, to be intellectually honest, to own when you screw up, to be appropriately self-disclosing. If you and your patient have earned the privilege for that disclosure, and always respectful of the patient's expertise. They know themselves better than you do. So if you read the book, I hope you'll enjoy it. Thank you.